The sound came from nowhere. It was not the deep rumble of artillery that Werner Brandt had learned to measure and predict. It was not the drone of high-altitude bombers that gave men time to scatter. This was something else entirely, a shrieking whistle that split the summer air and ended in thunder. Brandt pressed his eye harder against his binoculars. 300 meters south, where a German ammunition convoy had been hidden beneath camouflage netting, there was now only fire. Trees that had stood for 100 years lay snapped in half. A truck loaded with artillery shells cooked off in a chain of explosions that shook the ground beneath his boots. What was that? Private Erich Sommer stood beside the Panzer IV, his young face pale. He had arrived from training school only 4 days ago. He had never seen the Eastern Front. He had never watched men burn. "Jabos," said Feldwebel Koch from inside the tank. The veteran driver's voice carried the flat tone of a man who had stopped being surprised by death years ago. American fighter-bombers. But something is different today. Brandt lowered his binoculars. Through the smoke, he caught a glimpse of the attackers pulling up from their dive, P-47 Thunderbolts, their distinctive barrel-shaped bodies unmistakable. He had seen these aircraft before. They usually dropped bombs or strafed with their 8 machine guns. But today, white smoke trails followed them upward. Today, they carried something new. The date was June 28, 1944. 22 days had passed since Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Wehrmacht had expected to push the invaders back into the sea within 48 hours. Instead, the Americans and British had established a beachhead that grew stronger every day. German counterattacks had failed. German reinforcements had been delayed. And now, German tanks were dying before they could even reach the front lines. Brandt commanded 4 Panzer IVs hidden in a Norman apple orchard. His platoon had survived 3 years of combat, Poland, France, the endless nightmare of Russia. They had faced Soviet T-34s at Kursk. They had retreated through Ukrainian mud while partisans picked at their flanks. They had learned that survival in armored warfare required skill, luck, and the ability to read a battlefield faster than the enemy. None of that experience prepared them for what circled overhead. The radio crackled with panicked voices. A company commander 3 kilometers west reported losing 2 tanks to a single aircraft pass. A logistics officer screamed that his entire fuel depot was burning. An infantry captain begged for armor support that would never come because the armor was hiding under trees, engines cold, crews staring at the sky. "We stay here," Brandt ordered. "No movement until dark." His men did not argue. They had already learned the lesson that was now being taught to the entire Wehrmacht in Normandy. German tanks were the finest in the world. German crews were the best trained. German tactics were the most refined. None of it mattered when the enemy owned the sky. The Americans called their new weapon the high-velocity aircraft rocket. Each P-47 could carry up to 10 of them beneath its wings. Unlike bombs, which fell in an arc and required precise timing, these rockets flew straight and true. A skilled pilot could put one through a tank's engine deck from a shallow dive. The explosion would punch through armor that had been designed to stop shells, not weapons that struck from above. Brandt watched the smoke rise from the destroyed convoy. He counted the distant columns of black marking other kills across the Norman countryside. By his estimate, the Jabos had destroyed more German armor in the past week than the Allied ground forces had managed since D-Day. Private Sommer sat down heavily beside the tank's tracks. His hands were shaking. "Hauptmann, when do we fight back?" Brandt wanted to give the young man an answer. He wanted to speak of counterattacks and air cover and the promised new weapons that would turn the tide. But he had stopped believing in promises 2 years ago on the road to Stalingrad. "We survive," he said. "That is how we fight back. We survive until tonight. Then we move. Then we find a way to kill Americans on our terms, not theirs." The afternoon stretched into eternity. Every distant engine sound sent the men diving for cover. Every whistle of wine through the apple trees made hearts stop. Brandt watched his veterans, men who had charged machine gun nests and dueled with enemy tanks at point-blank range, reduced to frightened animals by a weapon they could not see coming and could not fight. As the sun finally began to set, painting the Norman sky in shades of orange and red, Brant allowed himself to breathe. They had survived another day. Tomorrow, they would receive orders to advance. Tomorrow, they would crawl out from beneath their camouflage and try to reach the front. Tomorrow, the devil's whistle would hunt them again, but that was tomorrow. Tonight, they were still alive. It would have to be enough. Oberleutnant Heinz Vogel died on a Tuesday morning in July, and Werner Brandt could do nothing but watch. The rocket struck Vogel's tank just behind the turret, exactly where the armor was thinnest. One moment, Brandt's oldest friend was commanding his Panzer IV through a gap in the hedgerows, waving his hand forward to signal the advance. The next moment, there was only fire. The ammunition inside the tank detonated 3 seconds later. The turret flew 15 meters into the air and landed in a farmer's field, still burning. Brandt's driver threw their tank into reverse. The engine screamed as Koch pushed it beyond its limits, desperate to reach the cover of the tree line before the American pilot could circle back for another pass. They made it. Barely. The P-47 roared overhead, its shadow passing across them like the wing of a hunting hawk, but no second rocket came. Perhaps the pilot was satisfied with one kill. Perhaps he had other targets. It did not matter. Vogel was dead. 3 weeks had passed since that first attack in the orchard. 3 weeks of hell. The hedgerow country of Normandy had become a killing ground. The Americans called it bocage, ancient fields divided by earthen walls topped with dense vegetation. Every hedgerow created a natural fortress. Every sunken lane became an ambush point. German defenders used this terrain to slow the Allied advance to a bloody crawl, making the enemy pay for every meter in bodies, but the Germans paid too. And their currency was armor. The Wehrmacht had entered the Normandy campaign with approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns in France. By mid-July, nearly half were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Allied ground forces accounted for some of these losses. Artillery claimed others. But the greatest killer was the sky itself. American and British aircraft flew thousands of sorties every day. They owned the air so completely that German planes rarely appeared at all. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Typhoon roamed freely, hunting anything that moved on the roads below. Their rockets, the Americans used the HVR, the British preferred the RP-3, had proven devastatingly effective against armored vehicles. Brandt's platoon had adapted. They moved only at night, crawling along back roads with headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory. They hid during the day beneath barns, inside forests, anywhere that offered concealment from above. They learned to listen for aircraft engines the way infantrymen listen for incoming artillery, with total attention and immediate response, but adaptation was not enough. Orders still came from headquarters demanding daylight movements. Staff officers who had never seen a Jabo insisted that attacks proceed on schedule. Communications broke down. Coordination failed. Men died following orders that made no sense to anyone who had faced the rockets. Private Sommer had stopped speaking 3 days ago. The young loader performed his duties mechanically, loading shells, clearing jams, maintaining the gun, but his eyes had gone empty. He had watched Vogel burn. He had seen the crew of the second tank bail out with their uniforms on fire, screaming as they rolled in the dirt. Something inside him had broken. Brandt understood. He had seen that look before, in Russia, when the winter and the endless Soviet attacks had ground men down to nothing. Some soldiers recovered. Others never did. There was no way to know which category Sommer would fall into until the war decided for him. That evening, as the sun set and the platoon prepared for another night march, Brandt sat down to write his after-action report. His hand trembled as he documented Vogel's death, the loss of the second tank to engine failure during the retreat, the current state of ammunition and fuel supplies. He described the rocket attacks in clinical terms: angle of approach, approximate speed, observed penetration effects, but clinical terms could not capture the truth. They could not explain what it felt like to be hunted. They could not describe the paralysis that gripped men when they heard the whistle. They could not convey the bitter irony of commanding the finest tanks in the world while being unable to fight back against aircraft that struck and vanished before a single shot could be fired. Brandt sealed the report and handed it to a motorcycle courier heading east. Perhaps someone at headquarters would read it. Perhaps they would understand that the rules of armored warfare had changed forever. Or perhaps the courier would be killed by a Jabo before he reached the next command post, and the report would burn with him. In the new Normandy, anything was possible. Everything was temporary. And the only certainty was that tomorrow the rockets would fall again. The road to Falaise was paved with the dead. Werner Brandt had seen retreat before. He had walked the frozen roads out of Russia in the winter of 1941, when the great offensive against Moscow collapsed and the Wehrmacht learned that victory was not inevitable. He had witnessed the chaos of Stalingrad's encirclement, watching from the outside as an entire army was swallowed by the Soviet trap. But he had never seen anything like this. It was August 1944. The American breakout at St. Lo had shattered the German defensive line. Allied forces now swept around both flanks of the Wehrmacht in Normandy, closing a vast encirclement near the town of Falaise. Two German armies, nearly 100,000 men, were trapped inside a pocket that shrank by the hour. The only escape was a narrow gap to the east, barely 10 kilometers wide. And every meter of that gap was being torn apart from the sky. Brandt's single remaining Panzer IV crawled through a traffic jam of destruction. Trucks burned on both sides of the road. Half-tracks lay overturned in ditches, their crews scattered in the fields where machine gun fire had cut them down. Horse-drawn supply wagons, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses despite its reputation for mechanization, added their own horror to the scene. Dead horses lay everywhere, their bodies bloated in the August heat. The smell was indescribable. Burning rubber, burning fuel, burning flesh. The smoke was so thick that Brandt could barely see 50 meters ahead. "I cannot do this." Feldwebel Koch's voice came through the intercom, flat and final. "I will not do this." The tank stopped. In the middle of the road. Surrounded by chaos. "Koch." Brandt kept his voice calm. "We need to move. The gap is closing. Let it close." The driver's laugh was hollow. "Let them capture us. Let them shoot us. At least it ends." Brandt had served with Koch for 4 years. The man had driven through Soviet minefields without hesitation. He had rammed enemy tanks when ammunition ran out. He had never shown fear, never hesitated, never broken, until now. The sound of aircraft engines grew louder. Somewhere to the south, rockets screamed down. More explosions. More fire. More screaming. Brandt made his decision. Everyone out. Now. The crew dismounted in confusion. Private Sommer had to be pulled from the loader's hatch. He had curled into a ball beside the ammunition rack, his eyes squeezed shut. The gunner, Gefreiter Muller, helped drag him down to the road. Brandt climbed onto the engine deck of his tank. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the machine that had carried them through 3 weeks of hell. The Panzer IV was scarred by shrapnel, its paint burned away in patches, one track link held together with wire. But it still ran. It could still fight. He opened the fuel cap and began draining the diesel into the dirt. "Hauptmann." Muller stared at him. "What are you doing? The Jabos will not claim this kill." Brandt's voice was steady. "We decide how our tank dies. Not them." When the fuel tank was empty, Brandt dropped a lit match into the engine compartment. The flames caught slowly at first, then spread with hungry speed. Within minutes, the Panzer IV was fully engulfed. Koch watched the fire with tears running down his cheeks. Whether they were tears of grief or relief, Brandt could not tell. "We walk," Brandt said. "East. Stay off the main roads. Move through the fields. Help anyone who can still move. Leave anything heavy behind." Sommer could not walk on his own. Shrapnel from that morning's air attack had torn open his left leg. The field dressing was already soaked through with blood. Brandt lifted the young private onto his back and began to move. They joined a stream of walking wounded, shell-shocked survivors, and leaderless soldiers all pushing toward the gap. Officers had lost their units. Units had lost their officers. The proud Wehrmacht, conqueror of Europe, had dissolved into a mob of desperate men trying simply to escape. The Falaise Pocket would later be called one of the greatest German defeats of the war. Nearly 10,000 soldiers would die inside the encirclement. Another 50,000 would be captured. The roads would be so clogged with destroyed vehicles that Allied commanders would describe the scene as comparable to the worst carnage they had ever witnessed, but Brandt did not know these numbers yet. He knew only the weight of Sommer on his back, the sound of the young man's ragged breathing, and the orange glow of burning vehicles that lit their path through the longest night of his life. Dawn found them east of the Seine. They had made it through the gap. Behind them, the trap had finally closed. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and death. Werner Brandt sat on the edge of a metal cot, his uniform still stained with the dirt and blood of the Falaise retreat. A week had passed since he carried Private Sommer through the gap. The young man lay in the bed beside him now, sleeping the deep sleep of heavy sedation. Surgeons had removed the shrapnel from his leg. He would live. He would probably never walk without a limp. A staff officer appeared in the doorway, clean uniform, polished boots, the look of a man who had spent the war behind a desk. He carried a leather notebook and introduced himself as Major Hartmann from the Wehrmacht's Armored Warfare Analysis Section. Hauptmann Brandt. I have been sent from Berlin. We are collecting first-hand accounts of the enemy's new air tactics. Your experience would be valuable. Brandt almost laughed. Valuable. His experience had cost him his tank, his platoon, and his oldest friend. Now it would become data in a report that staff officers would read while drinking coffee in heated offices, but he spoke anyway. What else was there to do? He described the first attack in the orchard, the sound of the rockets, unlike anything in his experience. He explained the tactical pattern the American pilots used, diving from medium altitude, firing multiple rockets in a single pass, pulling up before ground fire could track them. He detailed the psychological effects on crews who had faced Soviet armor without flinching but who trembled now at the sound of aircraft engines. Major Hartmann took careful notes. His face revealed nothing. Brandt continued. He spoke of the impossibility of daytime movement under complete Allied air superiority. He described watching rockets punch through armor that had been designed to stop tank shells. He explained how quickly trained crews broke under the pressure of being hunted constantly from above. The American designation is HVR, he said. High-velocity aircraft rocket. 5-inch diameter. Approximately 60 pounds total weight. Range of perhaps 1 kilometer when fired from a dive. The accuracy is remarkable. Our tanks were designed to fight other tanks. These weapons make that capability meaningless if we cannot reach the battlefield. Hartmann wrote faster. Recommendations, the Major asked. Brandt considered the question. What could he recommend? Build more anti-aircraft guns. The Allies would simply fly around them. Develop German rockets. The war would be over before production could begin. Retreat to positions where air cover existed. There were no such positions left. Win back the sky, he said finally. Or accept that armored warfare as we know it has ended. The Major closed his notebook. He thanked Brandt formally, professionally, with the polished courtesy of a bureaucrat completing an assignment. Then he moved on to interview other survivors in other wards. Brandt watched him go. The report would be filed. It would join hundreds of other reports documenting German defeats across every front. Perhaps someone important would read it. Perhaps it would change something. Or perhaps it would simply gather dust while the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. That night, Brandt tried to write a letter to Heinz Vogel's widow. He had known Helga for years. She had welcomed him into their home, fed him dinners, shown him photographs of the children. She deserved to know how her husband had died, but how could he explain it? Heinz had not fallen in glorious combat against an enemy he could see and fight. He had burned alive because a pilot 3,000 meters away pressed a button. There was no last stand. No heroic sacrifice. Just the whistle, the explosion, and then nothing. Brandt crumpled 3 attempts before finally settling on simple words. Heinz was brave. He never stopped being brave. The war has changed in ways none of us expected. He would want you to know that he thought of you at the end. That it was probably a lie. Heinz had likely thought of nothing at all in those final seconds. But what comfort existed in the truth? Brandt sealed the letter as Private Sommer stirred in the bed beside him. The young man's eyes opened, confused and frightened. Where are we, Hauptmann? Safe. Another lie. Nowhere was safe anymore. Rest. We made it out. Outside the hospital window, the distant drone of aircraft engines rolled across the evening sky. Brandt tensed automatically, waiting for the whistle. It did not come. Not tonight. Not yet, but the war was not over. There would be more retreats, more defeats, more pocket battles where German armor would try to hold against an enemy that dominated every dimension of warfare. The rockets would fall again. More tanks would burn. More crews would die, and somewhere, in some office in Berlin, a staff major would file a report that explained exactly why, and changed nothing at all. Werner Brandt closed his eyes and tried to remember what silence sounded like that he could not.